Hello everyone, and as promised, this is the first edition of my series of Kaiju/giant monster movie reviews that I'll be doing over the next few months, leading up to May 2019, where we will get the next Godzilla film to be released in the States, Godzilla King of the Monsters. And seeing as how I reviewed all the Godzilla movies prior to the 2014 film's release, I thought it was appropriate to this time around to celebrate my love of giant monsters and Kaiju and all that other stuff, the Tokusatsu films and all that. It would be fun to go back and look at all the other non-Godzilla monster movies that are out there that I've watched and experienced throughout my life, and do reviews of those and talk about what those movies meant to me. And very much like my Godzilla movie reviews from a few years ago, one does have to ask the question, what is it about giant monster movies that are so appealing? And part of it is that I did get into them when I was very young. It was just one of those things I just got into at a very young age, and I just couldn't get enough of giant monsters. And I think the appeal for me was, I was just fascinated by creatures and monsters that could not exist in this world. Because I knew even at a young age, there's no way that something like a Godzilla or a beast from 20,000 Fathoms or a Rodan or a Gamera or anything like that could ever exist. And that only captured my imagination, because it's like, okay, I know it's fake, I know it's not real, but god darn, it's just so entertaining and so much fun to watch. And I think I was also fascinated, and this is something that also motivated me to talk about other non-Godzilla monster movies. I was also fascinated by how many different techniques there were to bring these monsters to life. Obviously in the 90s, most American filmgoers are familiar with Jurassic Park, which combined a lot of different techniques to bring the dinosaurs to life, namely CGI, puppetry, animatronics, various other things. Different techniques were used to create these creatures. And then if you go back and you look at the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, obviously the popular Godzilla suitmation, guys in rubber suits tearing down model cities, that was a common method of bringing these creatures to life, but it wasn't the only way. Puppets were used. When you get into Ray Harryhausen, you get the stop-motion animated creatures, and when you look at a movie like them, you get big puppets and various other things. So I was also fascinated by the idea of how many different ways there were to bring these creatures to life. And really, it was these movies that got me interested in the art of filmmaking and how films are made, because there were just always these fascinating, even if it looked like utter garbage, like The Giant Claw or something like that, there was just something fascinating to me about the work that went into bringing these creatures to life and making these movies, and gives them, even the bad ones have like an everlasting charm that'll never completely go away from me. And with all of that said, like I said, this is going to be an 8-part series, so you're going to get one a month leading into May 2019 when we get Godzilla 2. And they're going to be divided into several sections. And the first 2 entries for September and October are going to be centered around basically a monster potpourri. Monsters around the world. And really what inspired me to do that, you can give credit to the new season of Mystery Science Theater, specifically the first episode, Reptilicus, which had a musical number talking about the monsters around the world and how every country has a monster. And I thought, there are all these other monster movies that don't really fit into a specified category, especially the way I'm laying them out, because there's going to be a King Kong video, there's going to be 2 Gamera videos, and there's going to be 2 videos centered around Toho, there's going to be 1 video centered around monsters on television. But then you have all these other ones that kind of fit into this, really don't fit anywhere. They're just kind of standalone and exist in their own little worlds, and they're global. Like, there's some made in Japan, there's some made in America, some made in Europe, some made in Korea, and various other things. So I thought starting things off with kind of the potpourri, the miscellaneous monsters, would be a fun way to start, because it's veritable grab bag. It's it could be anything could show up in these things, and I'm gonna focus these videos on movies that had an impact on me one way or another, because this was all determined by me. So a lot of the older movies I do in these next 2 entries are going to be centered around movies that I grew up with, mostly. And there'll also be some more modern day classics thrown in as well, just to celebrate the entire history of giant monsters and all the different techniques used to bring monsters to the screen and all the different filmmakers that brought these monsters to the screen and everything that they inspired. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. And the first two movies we'll be covering today are from Japan, not from Toho Studios and not from Dai, the guys who created Gamera and Daimajin. These two movies were both made in 1967, and the first one up is Gappa the Triphibean Monster, also known in the States as Monster from a Prehistoric Planet, which is not an accurate title considering Gappa is not a space monster, so that title makes no sense. But yeah, the movie is about the titular monster, Gappa, and features a plot that is very similar to another movie we'll be reviewing this video, but I'll get there later. But yeah, this is, as far as I know, this is the only monster movie made by the studio Nikkatsu. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And features a very standard plot as far as monster movies go, but it is very enjoyable for what it is. Gappa, you know, among kaiju fans is actually fairly well known. I was actually surprised because I saw this movie when I was very young and I had it on video. And when I first got onto the internet and started getting into, you know, Godzilla fandoms and kaiju fandoms and various other things, I was surprised at how many people actually knew what Gappa was. I thought I was like one of maybe 5 people in the entire country that that saw this movie, but apparently it's fairly well known among kaiju fans. In 1967, man, that must have been a killer year for kaiju movies because, you know, Gamera was at its peak and Godzilla was getting ready to do Destroy All Monsters. They had just done Son of Godzilla, so man, that's a lot of monster movies in one year. But anyway, Gappa is basically about the basic story is that the scientists go to an island with natives that warn them that, you know, don't disturb the land, don't do anything crazy, or else you'll anger our gods. And sure enough, they do something stupid. They kidnap a small bird/lizard-like creature, and I always like the design on Gappa because it does look like it's both like a bird and a lizard. It has like this nice little beak thing, and so they kidnap this young monster, and that unleashes or awakens and angers the parents. And then the parents go to Japan and tear shit up as expected. And it is one of those things, it's kind of like going back to the original Mothra film where, you know, these idiots, these idiotic scientists just feel the need to take something away from the unexplored area, and it just causes problems when you bring that thing back into civilization. And that's a plot that you see in various other movies. Some of them I'll be reviewing on this in this video even. And so yeah, the plot's fairly standard. The monsters look cool, and I do like the basic idea of two parents protecting their child. It's one of those movies that even though the monsters are destroying and killing people by the thousands, it is kind of you know, it's hard to feel sorry for the people it's hard to feel sorry for humanity when they're the ones that caused it. It's like, look, you just left the kid alone. You know, it's just, come on, guys, what are you thinking? What are you thinking? But yeah, the movie is actually fairly well made for a kaiju film, and special effects are mostly pretty solid. And it's a shame that, as far as I know, Nikkatsu didn't make a whole lot of other monster movies. Maybe this was their only one. Again, as far as I know. And I kind of wish that, oh God, I kind of wish this studio had like produce more of these things, because if they could make something as good as Gappa, they probably could have made a few other really good monster movies as well. And I think at this point, the 1960s, maybe as we entered the late 60s, maybe the monster boom had kind of come and gone. It was like entering like a decline. And certain studios were kind of, Nikkatsu probably came into the game pretty late, especially with the Gamera series in full swing and Godzilla in full swing. So yeah, they probably came into the game a little late, but as the standalone monster film that's just kind of like buried amidst like more famous names, I think it's pretty solid. It's pretty solidly made. And I wouldn't call it a classic or anything. I'm not going to say it's a must-see film. Like I said, it is pretty basic, but it is... the monsters are fairly well made and has a simple enough story that pretty much anybody can follow. It doesn't dwell on the techno-babble as much as some of the Godzilla movies do. And it's even kind of charming and cute in some places as well. So I think it's a fun watch. I think it's a really good movie. And if you're a Kaiju fan, I give it a somewhat strong recommendation. Not a must-see, but it is a pretty solid film and a fairly innocent hidden gem amongst a treasure trove of other monster movies. And the other movie I wanted to review from 1967 from Japan, The X from Outer Space, a movie that was released by Shochiku Studios. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. And as far as I know, this was also another case of where this was their only kaiju film during the golden age of Japanese monster films. And this is probably another example of a studio coming into the game late. And unfortunately, it is nowhere near as successful as Gappa in terms of what Gappa was able to achieve special effects-wise, tonally, or just competently. I guess this movie is pure cheeseball insanity, like almost from the word go. The science fiction on display is very well, it's crazy because they make space travel look like this perfectly normal, natural thing that goes on in everyday life. And so I'm assuming, again, I don't recall specific details, but I'm assuming it takes place in the future then if traveling to other planets is done so easily. But one of the things I think will catch people's attention when watching this is there's an American actress in the film. I'm not going to say her name to protect the identity. But, you know, a very attractive blonde girl, you know, a very striking, because you don't normally see that type of thing in Japanese monster movies. Unfortunately, she's also a terrible actress and probably shouldn't have been featured in the film. The acting's not very good in this thing, so... yeah, it's just pure science fiction cheese all the way through. And then when the monster finally shows up, and the monster in question is Gualala, or Guala, like, it's so funny because as a kid, my brother and I, we would watch these movies, we could never pronounce the damn thing. I think I called it Gualalalala is what I decided it was named when I was 6 years old. But Guala is a small spore that samples of it get brought back from the space trip, and then it comes back to Earth and gets exposed to our atmosphere or something, and mutates into what looks like a giant mutant triangular-headed chicken. Like, I don't know, it looks like there was like some chicken-like aspects there in its face, but then they just kind of quit and said, nah, fuck it, they'll just go for whatever. It's got big bug eyes, it's got like a little periscope on its head, which may be another eye, I have no idea. It's one of the most weirdly corniest, silliest designs I think I've ever seen for a giant monster, and it's the main monster of the movie. And it's just kind of a crazy, crazy thing to watch. Again, it's poorly made. I'm not going to sit here and say that it's a well-made film. It's poorly made. The monster is completely cheesy. The acting's bad. The science fiction is cheesy. It is very much a product of that era and that genre of filmmaking on the lower end of quality. The only way I could see anybody getting enjoyment out of this is if you just like pure schlock, which is what this is. This is schlock. Gappa actually flirts with competence, is actually fairly well made. This movie is just a friggin' shit show almost from the beginning. But it's totally cheesy, totally crazy, and it does have its fun, like, cheesy, crazy, stupid moments, but overall it's not that great. Now, to go a little bit further with Guala and the X from Outer Space, there was a sequel produced in 2008, or a reboot, sequel or reboot, I'm not sure which. I'd never seen it. I haven't seen it. I didn't watch it as part of this video review series. Apparently, from what I've been told, it's done in the vein of intentional comedy. So they go for straight up laughs in this thing. And Guala fights a giant 8-armed golden idol, which sounds awesome. And I kind of want to watch it now. It's like, God, why am I not watching the 2008 film? I really wish I could watch that thing. But really, that's all there is to say about poor Koala. He's just one of those weird, like, oddities that came about during this era where the monster designs were getting wackier and wackier and wackier, and I think they just swung for the fences with this guy, and what you get is what you get. But yeah, I thought the fact that it actually did get a sequel, I think is kind of interesting. And apparently, according to IMDb, there are rumors that Nikatsu and Shochiku, the two studios, were going to cooperate and create a Koala versus Gappa film. This idea was scrapped after Nikatsu closed in the early 90s or something akin to that. And it's like, man, that would have been the weirdest monster crossover that I don't know if anybody wanted. It's like the X from outer space meets the monster from a prehistoric planet. And it's like, yeah, and I mean, America, that would mean nothing because it's like, shit, it's, you know, I feel like I'm one of 10 people that saw that movie, or saw both movies for sure. So yeah, both movies really offer something different. I think if you're looking for something a little bit more well-made, something that's a bit more of a classier entry for the genre, check out Gappa the Triphibean monster. If you're looking for pure, cheesy, MST3K worthy schlock, check out the X from Outer Space. It's totally worth checking out for that. All right, so we're going to move out of Japan for now. Although, trust me, we're going to get, like, Japan's going to dominate this video series, so this is probably the least amount of Japanese films you're going to get here. But let's move into Europe, and let's go into one that was a big deal to me as a child. It was actually one of my favorites, right alongside Godzilla, and that would be 1961's Gorgo. Gorgo was a film that I adored as a kid. For me, my favorite giant monsters were Godzilla, King Kong, Gamera, and Gorgo. I friggin' loved Gorgo. I was all about Gorgo. He's basically, or she, I guess it's actually, because it's a mother, which I'll get into the plot in a little bit, but Gorgo to me was basically, oh, it's British Godzilla. Isn't that cool? I kind of think that's cool. So, the film is directed by Eugene Lorne, which I thought was interesting because he is also the director of The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms and The Giant Behemoth, which I will spoil for you right now. Those two movies will be reviewed in the next month's video in October. So if you want to see some Beast from 20,000 Fathoms and The Giant Behemoth and more on the works of Eugene Lorne, you will get them in next month's video, I promise. But one of the things I thought was really fascinating about this film is that it does use the guy in a rubber suit aspect, the suitmation aspect of creating giant monsters, that's a thing that I always associated with Japan and that style of filmmaking. So I thought it was really interesting that, oh, other countries did it too, other studios did it too, and you have this film that came out of London, and you've got a guy in a rubber suit tearing up a model city, and it's like, oh, cool. So it's like the techniques that were invented in Japan and what E.G. Tsuburaya's special effects teams did with the Toho films carried over and inspired other filmmakers as well, which I think is really neat. Kind of like how the stop motion special effects of King Kong inspired Ray Harryhausen and his whole library of work and everything that spawned from that. So I always like it when I see things like that, where inspirations affect future generations. You know, Tim Burton was impacted by Nosferatu. You know, it's just, I just love that type of stuff. If a film's able to, like, inspire people. But anyway, so Gorgo is a plot that is extremely similar to Gappa the Triphibean monster. So I guess you could say Gappa ripped off Gorgo in a way, where a bunch of scientists looking around, they kidnap a small-ish lizard/dinosaur aquatic creature that they name Gorgo, and they put him on display for the circus and turn him into a huge tourist attraction. Not knowing that not understanding that they should leave well enough alone. They discover that Gorgo is actually a child and is not fully grown. Mama comes ashore and destroys everything in her path. And, you know, they done effed up. And, you know, this is 1961, so it came out the same year as Mothra, which also had a very similar plot, where you take something from the monster's lair and the monster comes back and wrecks your shit. just don't steal from the monster and you'll be fine. It's like, come on, guys, what are you doing? But this movie was one that I watched a lot as a kid because I just really liked the design of Gorgo. It just had this, again, it's very Godzilla-like, but it's also got like the fins on the side and the red eyes and everything. And it just looked really cool going through London and destroying everything. So, again, much like Gappa, a very basic story, not going to reinvent the wheel or anything, but it is a fairly well-made monster movie, and those of you who are MST3K fans will recognize that this film actually did show up on Mystery Science Theater 3000, one of the earlier seasons, I think. I think it's one of the Joel episodes. And that was actually, Gorgo was actually one of my gateways to getting into Mystery Science Theater, because one of the things that struck me about Mystery Science Theater is that when I started watching the show, I was like, oh, hey, I've seen some of these movies before, and these guys are making fun of them. This is hilarious. The Gamera movies were definitely there. A couple of the Godzilla movies showed up on there, but Gorgo was another one of those films that showed up on Mystery Science Theater, and that kind of gave me an interesting gateway into watching one of my favorite TV shows of all time. So I always appreciated Gorgo for that as well, where it's like it affected me even later after I first discovered it. And made me a fan of something else completely different. So that was always something that I thought was neat about it. But yeah, I think the monsters look cool. I think the plot is solid enough. It's simple enough to where pretty much anybody can follow it. I think it's fun. I love, spoiler alert here. I'm just going to give a slight spoiler. I love that the monster didn't get killed at the end. Because typically in films like this, going back to the original King Kong, the tendency would be to kill the monster. And with Gorgo, the mother gets baby Gorgo and then they go home. And it's like, good. No, they deserve a happy ending because, you idiots were dumb enough to take her child and prep him up on display like a circus animal, and you get what you get. And the real tragedy came, instead of the tragedy coming from the monster dying, and it's like, oh, isn't that sad that the monster died? The tragedy comes from, hey, we done screwed up. Let's try and not do that anymore. So overall, I think Gorgo is an entertaining film. I think it's solidly fun, and some good monster action. And again, it's a different locale. You get a style of filmmaking that you normally get in Japan, but it's set in Europe, and it's set in London, and it has different landmarks and a different feel to it beyond what you normally get out of the Japanese film. So I think Gorgo is quite entertaining, and as a kid, it was one of my personal favorites, so I have a lot of fondness for it. Next up is another film that was also featured on Mystery Science Theater. This film also came out in 1961, was the very first episode of the new season of Mystery Science Theater that debuted on Netflix. So this was kind of like the return for Mystery Science Theater. Reptilicus, a Danish-made monster movie that, like I said at the start of the video, kind of this musical number that they worked into that episode inspired me to kind of organize the first two videos the way I did, where it was kind of that monster potpourri thing. So everything goes back to Mystery Science Theater, obviously. Now with Reptilicus, how do I want to say this? It's a movie that's perfect for Mystery Science Theater. Let me put it that way. It's absolutely the right film to start off with their new season. It's kind of weird in a way. One of the movies I am not reviewing as part of the series is The Giant Claw, because I didn't have the same attachment to that movie that, say, James Rolfe did, because I know James Rolfe references it a lot in some of his Monster Madness films and movie reviews and various other things. I don't have an attachment to that film. I've only seen it once, and it is what it is. I don't really have any opinions on it beyond my initial reaction to it, but I do think Reptilicus is very similar to that film in this one way. The film, I think, it has some decent build-up. The acting's not great, and that's actually another thing I want to talk about. The film was actually filmed and produced in two different languages. There's a Danish version and an English version, and the casts and crews are almost identical. I think there's maybe one actor that got left out of the Danish version, or one actor from the Danish version that didn't make it into the English version or whatever. But for the most part, they basically filmed the movie twice in two different languages using the same cast and crew, which I think is is fascinating. It's kind of like, the original Bela Lugosi Dracula, and there's also a Spanish version of it, but those films had different casts and different crews. This one, it sounds like, at least based on my research, that similar cast, similar crews, different directors. But I've only seen the English version. Just want to make that perfectly clear. That's the only version I've seen. So I haven't seen the Danish version. Maybe the Danish version's better. I don't know. But it's similar to the Giant Claw in this one way, where the build up to the monster, even though the acting's not great and some of the characters are annoying, there's some comedy relief characters that are kind of obnoxious in this thing. And the female characters in this are kind of flighty and airheaded for the most part. But what I thought was interesting is that the build-up to the monster is actually fairly good. Basically, scientists they discover like a severed tail from a monster or from an ancient creature, and they bring it home to study it. And the tail regenerates into a full monster, which is Reptilicus, and runs amok throughout the town and causes all kinds of mayhem. And that's all well and good. Again, very basic plot, and that's all fine. And the build-up to the monster, I think, is fairly effective. Slowly getting to that point where the monster slowly regenerates and then becomes a true threat. The problem is that the build-up's good, but then when you finally see it, when you finally see Reptilicus, it is so bad. That creature is so laughably bad that you can't help but just laugh at it. It almost feels like the directors were playing a joke on us. It's like, wait, all that buildup for that? Are you fucking serious? Like, try to imagine like all the buildup to the T-Rex in Jurassic Park, and it's like a sock puppet. That's basically what happens here. Where what I'm looking at looks like something crafted by Jim Henson for a Muppet movie, like one of the Muppet monsters, like Sweetums, would have looked better than this. It just looks so ridiculous and so poor, and it spits like this green acid thing, and that effect looks terrible too, and it's, oh my god, and once the monster's introduced, it's all downhill from there, and the movie just becomes a farce. And again, the Giant Claw is very similar to that, where decent build-up, but then the monster shows up and you just laugh at it. So Reptilicus, I think, is a really funny, cheesy, silly, stupid-looking monster. And again, it's a Danish-made film. It was not a Japanese production, so you can tell, Gorgo, for the most part, is fairly well made. This film feels like it was made by people that saw a Godzilla movie and thought, oh, hey, we can make that, and then just made the worst possible version of it that they could possibly make. And it's a shame, too, because like I said, some of the build-up to the monster is really good, but, it is what it is. So, but I do highly recommend checking out the Mystery Science Theater episode on Netflix. I really like the new season on Netflix. Not all of it is great. Some of the host segments are hit or miss, but the original show was that way too. I really, when it comes to Mystery Science Theater, I'm in it for the movie and the riffing of the movie, and that's mostly great. And Reptilicus was a good episode for reintroducing Mystery Science Theater. So overall, I thought it was pretty solid. And the remaining 6 movies I'll be covering in this month's video all come from America. USA, USA, USA. Turns out those pesky Americans can make giant monster movies too, and have been for decades. Going all the way back to the 1950s with the famous, or infamous, depending on how you look at it, nuclear power causes giant monsters to run amok style movies, and moving into today with modern day classics, starting with Jurassic Park in the early 90s, and then continuing to today where we have movies like Pacific Rim, Rampage, and even our own American-made Godzilla movies. So lots of things to talk about here, but I'm going to start with the oldest film first, 1954's Them. 1954, a year more commonly associated with the first Godzilla movie, but America was making their giant monster movies too at around the same time, and the movie Them, which is very exploitative, kind of weird, mysterious title that would have been fairly common for 1950s cinema, especially of this type of film, and the level of science fiction that was being developed at around this time period. And most people probably know this movie as the giant ant movie, because that's basically what it is. It's an often celebrated film. Actually, I own it on DVD, and it's paired up with The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, which are probably the two most remarkable films of its type to be released around this time period. But yeah, most people, if you've never seen the movie Them, there's a real good chance you've probably seen clips of it with the giant ants, the giant puppet ants that are there on screen. And yeah, it's pretty much exactly what you would expect from a movie like this. It's giant ants running amok. They were birthed by atomic power, and that's basically all there is. And scientists and the military tries to stop them, and that's basically the whole movie. And one aspect of this film that I really liked, aside from the monsters, which I'll get to that in a minute, but one aspect that I liked as far as how the story develops, again, it is very much like its contemporaries, whereas to compare it to the original Godzilla, one of the things I admire about the original Godzilla was that it really forged its own path and was just trying to be its own thing without trying to match what the American films were like. This movie is very much cut from the same cloth as a ton of other movies that were coming out at the same time. But what one aspect that this film has that I really like is kind of a globe-trotting aspect. It's not really globe-trotting, but there's a sense of... there's more of a global scale to this film because one of the fears that the ants... that come along with the ants is reproduction and building nests. And actually, they're discovered in Mexico, but the film ends in Los Angeles, specifically a fight in the sewers with giant flamethrowers being used to fight the giant ants. So that's pretty cool. So that's really what this movie offers. Again, it's just giant ants running around, attacking people, and then people fight them with flamethrowers. It's that type of movie. There's not a whole lot of story or character development or anything like that. It's just giant ants, deal with it, fight the giant ants, and you get the action scenes associated with it. And the giant ants themselves, for a movie made in 1954 using puppetry to kind of bring these things to life and kind of, scale models whatever to bring these creatures to life, I think they're pretty effective, and they've got like a charm to them. You can kind of tell that they're puppets, but for the time period, they look pretty good, and there's kind of this weird charm to it. And I also appreciate, to go back to what I was talking about earlier, different styles being used to create these monsters. A movie like this is something I would have expected to be stop motion creatures. Actually, I own this movie on DVD, and it's actually paired up with, it's a 2 DVD set with The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, which is the other really famous movie to come out from the 1950s. Again, as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to be covering that movie next month, but with them, I kind of appreciate that they didn't go the stop motion route, so it kind of allows this film to stand on its own and have an identity of its own. And as far as comparing it to many of the other films of its type, like The Giant Claw, to use an example I used earlier, I think Them is one of the better ones of that subgenre of American films that were coming out at the time. Again, it's meant to be a cautionary tale about the rise of the atomic age, and also many movies of this type were thought to be allegories for the rise of the Soviet Union and the threat of communism on American society, which was very prevalent in the 1950s and was something that I guess shaped a lot of their media. But this movie, a lot of that stuff kind of has been lost to the sands of time in a way. It would probably be lost on modern day audiences. But this movie, what it does effectively is it brings these monsters to life, and the action scenes themselves for the time period, for 1954, are fairly impressive. So it doesn't look like a complete cheeseball fest. Again, there are a million films that came out in the 1950s that are just like this. It's nothing special in that regard. But the ants look cool, and the action scenes are cool, and they fight them with flamethrowers in the film's climax, which is pretty neat. So, again, it's this type of movie you've seen 100 times, but if you like that type of movie, I think this one's kind of a must-see. Because it is one of the best of that type of film, even though they're all kind of cut from the same cloth. The ants were pretty cool, and that was what drove me to it when I was young. I just thought the ants looked friggin' cool, and the idea of again, to play into the way my imagination worked back then, I was always fascinated by ants and how there were always like large groups of them and large nests. And you look at an anthill and you'd see like dozens of them just come out of the anthill or something like that. I didn't torture ants with magnifying glasses before anybody asked. That was never something I did. I was just kind of always fascinated. I was like, man, if these things were giants, they'd overrun us, no questions asked. And then you watch a movie like them, and it's like, oh yeah, it's that thing I said. If these ants were big, we'd be in deep shit. But yeah, so I think Them is an entertaining movie. I think it's, if you're a fan of the genre, if you're a fan of giant monsters, I think it's definitely worth your time. It's not, again, there's not a lot of substance to it beyond just showcasing the monsters, but for that, they do that well, and it is fun, and it is exciting to watch. So I have an appreciation for them, and I think it's worth checking out. So now we're going to go a little bit out of order here, jumping around from closer to more modern classics. We're actually going to go to the newest film on the list that I'm covering today. Coming out in American, made in America, made by Hollywood, coming out this year even. The video game adaptation Rampage, starring Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, and is based off the old school video game that I played a lot as a kid, where you play as giant monsters. In the NES port that I had, it only had Lizzie and George, Lizzie being the giant lizard and George being the giant ape, obvious stand-ins for Godzilla and King Kong. And the arcade version has a giant wolf named Ralph, who would eventually show up in the N64 version of the game, which I also played. So I have an appreciation for the game Rampage. It's probably the single most monotonous game ever played or ever made, where it's just you running around blowing shit up and bashing buildings. So for 4-year-old me, 5-year-old me, it was very cathartic. And it's like, look, I don't care. I don't need to beat the game. I'm just here to beat shit up. And that's basically all the game is. But it never got adapted into a movie until 2018. I feel like they're a little late to be adapting this into a movie. But yeah, I guess I'll just go ahead and talk to it since it is relevant to giant monsters and it is a part of my childhood. It ties into something that I'm somewhat nostalgic about. So what did I think of Rampage? I thought it was kind of dull. It's kind of unremarkable. You're probably going to forget about it 2 months after you see it. It's probably the best video game movie ever made, which ain't saying much. And for anybody who knows the entire history of video game movies, those have not been treated well at all. Probably the best video game movies up to this point were like Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter, and those are, not good. I know a lot of people like the Mortal Kombat film, but I'm not a huge fan of it. But those movies only have any kind of appreciation for the schlock factor, not because they were actually legitimately good adaptations. And so video games not treated well. Actually, I'll be honest, the best video game adaptation I think I've ever seen was the Netflix Castlevania show, which was really good. Hopefully season 2 continues to be good. We shall see. But Rampage, like I said, it was way too late to be making a video game movie based on Rampage. And the movie itself is just so dull because it doesn't do anything new. It feels like we've seen all this before, and I think that's the film's biggest flaw. It's not necessarily the dumbest thing I've ever watched. It's not the worst thing I've ever watched. I mean, it's certainly less insulting than, say, the Transformers movies at their worst, but it's just a big, loud, dumb blockbuster that's meant to blow shit up and showcase some monsters. And that's pretty much all there is to it. And unfortunately, it doesn't have that same charm factor that a movie like Them has, where the special effects are a large part of the appeal. With CGI, and I know I sound like an old man yelling at the sky, but with CGI, it doesn't have that same leeway where it's just like, oh, there's no magic there. It's just they just did it on a computer. It's like, oh, okay. And so that's that. If I had to go over the cast, Negan from The Walking Dead is good in it. They basically just asked him to basically play Negan, but as a good guy, like a federal FBI agent, I think he is. And he's got a good presence when he's on screen. The Rock is charming as hell, as always. The weird thing about The Rock is that he's in a lot of bad movies, but he's never the thing that's bad about the movie. He's always good, even in the bad movies he's in. And it's like, God, dude, I wish you'd pick better projects, because you are so goddamn charming on screen. And this is no exception. He's very likable in this movie. It's just... And actually, if I had to pinpoint a best aspect of this film, it's the relationship between The Rock and George, who's, The Rock plays a guy who works at a, I forget what it was. Was it a zoo or an animal shelter or something like that? Because Rock looks like the type of guy that would work at an animal shelter, of course. And the gorilla gets infected with the disease that causes the animals to grow, and he's watching his best friend grow and become an unstoppable monster. And so there's that tragic element there that's not fully explored. But some of the scenes of Rock interacting with George are pretty neat. And the motion capture on George is actually fairly effective. The motion capture actor who played George is actually going to be playing one of the three heads for King Ghidorah in Godzilla King of the Monsters. So again, everything ties back to Godzilla. But so those aspects to it were good. Malin Ackerman plays like the evil head of the corporation that created the disease and is trying to cover everything up, and she's the bad guy of the film. I have seen her in a few films. She was in Watchmen. She was in that movie with Ben Stiller, The Heartbreak Kid. She's probably a really nice person. I do not like her as an actress. She just, everything she's been in, I'm like, nope. Not feeling it. Just not feeling it from her. She was the weakest part of Watchmen. She wasn't good in Heartbreak Kid, which admittedly wasn't a great film anyway, but it's just... And I didn't much care for her in this because she's supposed to be the villain, and she has no presence or anything memorable about her, and it's like, whatever. But, yeah, and the monsters themselves, it feels like, with the exception of George, who looks like it, and they made him an albino gorilla, but he looks like a gorilla. It looks fairly effective and close to what you would expect. But with Lizzie and Ralph, they went overboard to make those things look like really awesome and wicked and jagged spikes everywhere and huge fangs and everything, and they don't even look like Lizzie's supposed to be a crocodile. It gets to a point where they added so much to the design that it's like it doesn't even look like a crocodile anymore. Ralph the wolf doesn't even look like a wolf by the time it's fully grown. So why not just have a big wolf? Why not just have a big crocodile running around the city? I don't know, like that'd be neat. Like that would look somewhat probably look even funnier, to be honest. But yeah, and that's basically all there is to say about Rampage. It's not a terribly insulting film. It's not the worst thing I've ever seen. It is just so painfully dull and unremarkable that I almost feel like I'm wasting my time talking about it here, because it's I felt like I've said more about this film than most people probably should or could say about it. So overall, again, not something I'd recommend unless you're in the mood for loud, dumb action. That's really the only reason to check this movie out. Or if you're a fan of The Rock, you get more of The Rock in this. So, there's that. But let's move on to something much better, a movie that came out a few years ago in 2013, and a movie that I really enjoyed and really touched all my buttons as a giant monster movie fan. Pacific Rim, the movie made by Guillermo del Toro. And this really did feel like a nerd vanity project from Guillermo, where you get the impression that he grew up just like me, and he's older than me, so he probably saw a lot of these movies in the theaters. He grew up loving the tokusatsu giant monster movie kaiju films, and he just decided, I'm going to make myself a friggin' kaiju film with giant robots, and I'm just going to go nuts and do whatever I want. And that's pretty much what he did here with Pacific Rim. But one of the things that separates Pacific Rim from a lot of other dumb blockbusters is I like a lot of the finer details, and I like the lore. And I also love that the movie starts off, we're already halfway through the war. Like, the war is coming to an end already, and we're living in a world that's already dealt with these giant monsters that show up through this magical breach and invades the planet. They build giant robots to fight them, as you do. I mean, that's the natural way to go about it. You build giant robots. But a lot of the lore and of how, like, the wars between the Jaegers, the robots, and the Kaiju, which they actually do call Kaiju in this, which I really like. And that whole aspect to it, I think, is great and very well set up. And again, I like that it's not necessarily an origin story. It's we're coming into the world, like, in the middle of the story, and that's something I really like. I also like a lot of the fine details on how the Jaegers work, and the whole idea of drift compatibility, and the two pilots of the Jaegers need to be in sync with each other and draft compatible to link their minds into the robot to be able to work the robot. And I think that adds a lot to kind of the science fiction aspect to it, and the technobabble, and gives the characters a reason to work together and unite with each other and everything. And I'd also be remiss if I didn't mention some of the cast members in this. Actually, you know, the two leads, who are the main Jaeger pilots, not pirates, the two Jaeger pilots of Gypsy Danger, the main Jaeger. They're fine, and their relationship is fine, and I'm completely okay with them, but it's really the side characters who really shine. I think the two scientist characters are great. The one character who's a big kaiju groupie, as he's described in the film, I think he's fantastic, and he was one of my favorite characters. We get Ron Perlman in the film, and he's great in it. We get Idris Elba, who has all the best lines in the film, and is so friggin' great in this film. You know, when people tell me that Pacific Rim didn't have any great characters and doesn't have any great lines, I'm like, we are canceling the apocalypse. That line is classic. And Idris Elba has such a commanding presence, is so great in this film, and I sorely missed him in the sequel, which I will get there in a minute, but let me gush over Pacific Rim. So, like I said, I think the world, the story, the characters are fairly well set up all the way through, and I like a lot of the finer details. So when you get into the monster battles, it's fantastic. And again, Guillermo, like, he and I are maybe we're drift compatible when it comes to kaiju films, because listening to the director's commentary, I loved that he mentioned every monster in the film is designed with a Nakajima factor. What's the Nakajima factor? According to Guillermo, the Nakajima factor is he wanted all of the monsters, even though they're doing everything in CGI, he wanted the monsters to be designed in a way where they could have been men in rubber suits. And played by Haru Nakajima, who was the original suit actor who played Godzilla and many other monsters for Toho. And that was like, goddamn, like, Guillermo, you did it right, man. You totally did it right. And the monster designs themselves are great. And they all have these wacky names like, you know, Knifehead and Razorback and Slattern and Scunner, I think, is Otachi was one. You know, just all these really great designs. And Otachi was actually, as far as the monsters go, was actually kind of the show stealer. Because that thing, the fight in Hong Kong, I think, is the best scene in the movie, best action scene in the movie anyway. And you get all sorts of great stuff because all the monsters, all these weird, wacky designs, and then the Jaegers keep pulling out all these surprises, and all the Jaegers have their own unique designs, which is great to see. So just every action scene looks different, and the Jaegers all look great, the monsters all look great, and it's just a fun time if you like giant robots and giant monsters. And really, it was this movie that I pointed to where I'm like, man, I now realize how shitty the Transformer movies are, because, you know, you've got the robots flipping through the air and doing all this stuff, and it's all shot with shaky cam and super close up, and you can't tell who anybody is, and it looks terrible. All the action in Pacific Rim is captured well, and there's a logic to how the monsters and the robots move. One of my favorite little details, again, going back to the smaller details, is the rocket punch, where there's like a little rocket in the elbow of the robot, and it pushes the fist forward to give a harder punch, which makes total sense for something that big, that weighs as much as that thing does, would need some kind of extra propulsion to make the punches truly effective, especially on the giant kaiju. So, yeah, I guess if I have a knock on Pacific Rim, the action is so good throughout so much of the film that the climactic battle seems like a little bit of an anticlimax. I don't want to say it's a total anticlimax, but it just felt like by that point, I felt like the movie peaked action-wise with the scene in Hong Kong. And the final battle with the first ever level 5 kaiju, which I love that they categorized the kaiju as well. That's also a nice little touch. It didn't quite hold up as well as some of the other action scenes in the movie, but overall I think it's a really fun film, action-packed all the way through, and again, it has a lot of those finer details and very unique among films of its type. It's Pacific Rim was one of the few giant big blockbuster films in the last few years that really felt like it had something original to it beyond just, hey, let's appropriate this existing intellectual property and you know, do another reboot or something like that. This one felt like, even though it was heavily inspired by the classic kaiju films of the 60s and the 50s, it is very much its own thing, and that's something I really appreciate about it, and just points to the wonderful imagination that Guillermo del Toro has. Boy, I wish I could say the same thing about Pacific Rim Uprising, which was the sequel that also came out this year, which, to be perfectly honest, might be the worst movie I've seen this year. And it's so sad because Pacific Rim was a movie I really wanted a sequel to. I mean, I really wanted a sequel to Pacific Rim, but the first movie didn't do that well domestically, and I'm like, we're probably not going to get it. But it did well enough overseas, and it built up enough of a cult following to where they said, screw it, let's just do a sequel. The problem with the sequel is that everything I said that was great about the first Pacific Rim, like those finer details and the lore that was established and everything, this movie completely throws that out the window and just goes for loud, dumb, stupid action sequences. And, I talked about the characters in the first film. The characters in this film that are even remotely likable are the ones who are returning from the previous film. The new characters are so unlikable and obnoxious that you just want to punch the screen every time they come on. John Boyega, who got his name for the new Star Wars movies, it is very rare that I am that irritated with an actor, but the entire movie, because he's supposed to be playing the son of Idris Elba's character from the first movie. And I was like, man, you are no Idris Elba. You are not at all. And, the attempts at being funny and the just every time he was on screen, he just irritated me. So, and he's supposed to be like the main character in the film. And the Jaeger pilots in this movie are also like small children, not small children, but they're like young teenagers, like new recruits that go into battle when the Kaiju return. And I'm just like, really, we're doing the Goonies? We're doing Goonies with giant robots, which almost feels like I'm insulting Goonies. I feel like I owe Goonies an apology by making that comparison, but it's didn't appeal to me. Did not appeal to me at all. And the action scenes are nowhere near as good. The story makes no sense in terms of being a continuation of the first film, where I don't want to give away too many spoilers, but the way the Kaiju are worked back into the story after being soundly defeated in the original film makes little to no sense. And the action sequences are nowhere near as good. And like I said, a lot of the rules and the finer details that were there in the first movie, like things like the rocket punch, are not there in this movie. And it just feels like... It never feels like these characters or the robots or the Kaiju have any kind of weight or density to them. They're just computer-generated images taking up the screen. And, it's just... and I guess that's what you get when you don't have Guillermo there writing the ship or keeping everything afloat. It's just a mess from start to finish. And thoroughly unentertaining film that is stupid, annoying, loud, obnoxious, and... If the first movie made me want sequels, the second movie makes me wish, don't ever revisit this property ever again, for the love of God, because I can't bear to sit through another one of those. And it made me sad, because I really liked the first movie, and this one was just the complete opposite. Like, worst movie I've seen this year makes Rampage look like a masterpiece, like I almost owe Rampage an apology. And just a disaster, so disappointing that it turned out the way it did. Although I could tell from the trailers, I'm like, oh no, what happened? And sure enough, the movie lived up to its trailer. And it's a shame, too, because there's a lot of things where they stumble onto an interesting idea. Like, just as an example, there's a rogue Jaeger that's going around and attacking things. And this is before the Kaiju have even showed up. And I thought, okay, so the mystery of the rogue Jaeger is going to kind of drive the story. They resolve it so quickly and the payoff is so weak that it's almost like, why'd you even include that? It was so stupid. And it just felt like it was just another missed opportunity for what could have been a good movie. But it's a shame, but Pacific Rim Uprising was almost completely irredeemably bad. And like I said, probably the worst movie I've seen this year. So absolutely dreadful. Completely. So let's go on to a movie that happened a decade earlier and is much better. Let's go to Cloverfield. I don't think I've ever talked about Cloverfield in any of my videos, but basically people know this film as the film that gave people motion sickness in the movie theater, and basically it's Blair Witch meets Godzilla. And this movie came out at the same time that like the Paranormal Activity had come out, and the found footage thing, which got overplayed to the nines, was, I mean, my God, that the found footage deal flooded the cinemas for way too long. And I made the comparison to Blair Witch. Blair Witch was like the first of its type to really do that and really succeed on a huge level. But really, it was the Paranormal Activity films when those started coming out, and then every horror movie that came out had to be a friggin' found footage film. Thank God we've moved past that, and horror movies are becoming good again, and we're actually getting fairly solid horror movies on a regular basis in the theater, which is nice. Cloverfield was another movie that came out during that period where the found footage thing was becoming oversaturated, shall we say. This movie, however, works for me, and the reason the found footage aspect works in this film and why it doesn't in a lot of other films, it creates a different perspective on a story that we've seen a million times. Like, you take a movie like Godzilla, like Them, like The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, or any other giant monster movie, King Kong, you get, giant monster runs amok, and it's the scientists and the politicians and anyone closely associated with the case and knows the monster inside and out. They're the ones associated with the story, and they're the ones trying to stop it. Here, doing the found footage aspect here actually added a different dimension to it, where we're basically getting a Godzilla movie from the point of view of the nameless souls that run away. And that was interesting to me. So, a lot of the things that people complained about with this movie, like you never really get a good look at the monster, and they never explain where the monster comes from. To me, those are the movie's strengths, because we are seeing a Godzilla movie from the point of view of people who have absolutely no idea what's going on. And that made it work for me, and it was kind of like adding a new twist on a decades-old idea, and that made it a little bit more interesting to me. So things like never really getting a good look at the monster and never explaining where the monster came from, that's all completely fine with me, because that's kind of what is the driving force of the movie. It's these people trying to survive this ordeal that they have absolutely no idea what's going on, and things just keep getting worse and worse and worse and worse, where the monster will destroy the bridge while a bunch of people are on it, and then people try to escape through the sewers, and they get attacked by the parasites that are coming off of the monster, and those scenes are really effective as well. Now, this does have the same problem as a lot of other found footage films, which is, why the fuck are you running around filming all this? Which a lot of movies have this problem. I actually just rewatched Paranormal Activity 3, and it's one of the better Paranormal Activity films, but you look at that ending and it's like, dude, why are you filming all this? Just get the hell out of the house. What are you doing? Call the cops or something. I mean, my God. Like, why are you running around filming all this? But anyway, whatever. But those are the problems that are inherent with the found footage film. And so those problems are still present here, but I was willing to forgive it because I felt like the monster and all the drama associated with surviving the monster and the parasites, which was a nice little added bonus, and a lot of the scenes centered around that, I think are fairly effective for the most part. And overall, I think the movie's pretty good. I really like the film, and I really enjoy it. And I can understand why some people don't like it. They don't like the motion sickness aspect to it. They don't like, they like to be able to see the monster and like the full spectacle of it, and don't like, some people just don't like found footage movies, which I kind of sort of don't like a lot of them myself, but this one worked for me, and I think it's an overall very entertaining film and a great giant monster film. And basically, like I said, it took a Godzilla movie and added a different dimension to it, which I appreciated. So this film has also been tied to various other films as part of like a shared universe thing, I guess. 10 Cloverfield Lane and the Cloverfield Paradox. I have not watched either film. I don't know exactly what its connections are to the original film. I kind of don't need a sequel to this. I'm kind of fine Cloverfield standing on its own and being as is. So yeah, I think Cloverfield is just a overall pretty entertaining monster flick and a different way of doing a giant monster flick. So overall, pretty entertaining film, and I enjoyed it. And let's close things out with a true blue classic, a cinematic masterpiece that has stood the test of time, and it's 2.5 decades old and has a franchise that's still going to this day. Jurassic Park, 1993's masterpiece from Steven Spielberg. And I'm not going to talk about any of the sequels because, quite honestly, they're not that good and they're not bad enough to warrant talking about. So Jurassic Parks 2, 3, and then Jurassic World and Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom are all blah. They're just blah. And I'd rather just talk about the original film. So the original masterpiece from Steven Spielberg is one of the most influential films of its time and very groundbreaking in terms of the special effects and what they were able to do to create these dinosaurs and bring them to the big screen. Like I said, a lot of puppetry was used, a lot of animatronics were used, but the CGI in this film, which still looks amazing to this day. I mean, you look at that T-Rex and the reveal of the T-Rex and the way it moves and the way it looks up against lighting, it looks about as good as CGI can possibly look. And it's just amazing what they were able to do to get these things to work. And it's amazing to me that a lot of movies just can't match what was done back in 1993. You would think it would have gotten better, and it really, in a lot of cases, it hasn't. You know, the CGI that looks really good to me are like the recent Planet of the Apes films, Gollum and Lord of the Rings, and you know, some of the special effects in Lord of the Rings. But for the most part, like the movies today that come out today, like everything looks synthetic and cartoony and doesn't have that same organic look to it that the dinosaurs in Jurassic Park did. And they all still look amazing to me to this day. But what really makes Jurassic Park work, it is a basic survival film. Very much like something like Jaws, which is also made by Steven Spielberg. But what really makes it work are like the characters and the way they talk to each other and the conversations that they have. Grant not really liking kids, but has to be the one in charge of taking care of the two kids throughout the film, so he has a character arc there. The discussions about chaos theory and Jeff Goldblum being his absolute Jeff Goldblumiest throughout the entire film is flippin' great. John Hammond, spared no expense. You know, Richard Attenborough playing that role perfectly and just a wonderful character, and a lot of the way they talk to each other and debate about whether or not it's the right thing to do to bring these dinosaurs back to life. All of that is great, and I think that adds a lot to the film and gives it more resonance than just running away and surviving dinosaurs. And I think that's kind of the thing that's hurt some of the Jurassic Park sequels, where the story and the characters are nowhere near as good, so you just get the dinosaur stuff. And it's just kind of like, it just feels kind of soulless. But this film feels like it has its soul. And of course, it's based off the novel by Michael Crichton, which is very good, and I highly recommend checking out the book as well. If you haven't read it. Excellent book. But this film, there's so many moments, especially with the raptors, that are really good, like the scene of them chasing the human survivors through the compound, and you know, the slowly opening the door. Like the more the raptors learn, they pick up things like how to open doors and things like that. That's all really effectively done. And the T-Rex face turn at the end, of course, is great. And the reveal of the T-Rex is one of my favorite scenes in cinema history, because it's just the suspense and the reveal and how all of that is achieved. It's just masterfully done. And there's just so much cool stuff in this movie. And even like the side dinosaurs, like the Triceratops and the brontosauruses and various other things, they just all inhabit this wonderfully imaginative world that's being presented to us. And it's both dangerous, but there's also a lot of wonder surrounding it too, and a lot of majesty surrounding it. The Dilophosaurus scene is kind of great as well. You know, that's the scene where he attacks Newman in the Jeep. I think is a very effective scene. So there's a lot of really good stuff in there. And if you want a movie that just showcases the majesty and the horror of dinosaurs, this is the movie for you, because it's almost no movie has done it better than Jurassic Park in my mind. And it's still good to this day. Here we are 2.5 decades later, and I still think the movie holds up very well, still has great suspense, still has great drama, and it still looks great. The special effects have aged very, very well. And again, I think part of that is because it's not all CGI. They just use CGI for the scenes for the shots they couldn't get practically, and they use a lot of practical effects that are really good. And the movie's also super quotable too. Life finds a way. I spared no expense. Clever girl. So there's a lot of great lines as well. So it's just a really charming, very well made survival film. It's like one of the best films of its type ever made, and was a very influential film in both bad ways and good ways, because once this came out, everything that came after it tried to rip it off. I've argued that the TriStar Godzilla film turned out the way it did in large part because they were trying to recapture the feeling of Jurassic Park, and it didn't work. But yeah, Jurassic Park is an absolute cinematic masterpiece, and I knew I had to include it on this list. And, you know, I think the T-Rex constitutes a giant monster, so I was absolutely excited to come on here and talk about Jurassic Park, which is one of the best films of my childhood, and definitely something I highly recommend checking out if you have not seen it already. So, that concludes part 1 of my Kaiju movie review series. I got it. We're one video in, but I've got much, much more to go. So, like I said, this is going to continue once a month. You'll be getting one video from me with several reviews. I think this video has the most reviews on it, the way I have everything mapped out. So this one might turn out to be the longest, but we'll see. I don't know. Never underestimate my ability to babble. But next month you'll be getting Monsters Around the World Part 2 with various other films. I will be focusing on a few surprises from Asia, as well as the works of a special effects filmmaker that I have a lot of respect for, the man known as Ray Harryhausen. So we'll be focusing on his work as well. So stay tuned for more. I can't wait to do more of these. I've only touched the tip of the iceberg at this point, so we've got a long way to go, but it's going to be a lot of fun. So you Kaiju movie fans, you're in for a treat.